Okay, this is our last lecture, and indeed it is on a topic that I consider to be one of the most interesting ones and one of the most important ones in psychology. Again, we're going to be taking a look at social psychology and taking a look at some of the wonderful experiments that have been done in this area. Let me also say, like as I have often in the past, is that the to do this justice, what I've done is picked a few classic studies to talk about. But the whole field of social psychology, there's so much going on in it, and there's so many wonderful experiments that have been done. And again, I encourage you to take a class in social psychology, a year-long a semester-long course. So please do consider that if you're going on in the field of psychology. It's really an important subject. So one of the things that I try to do is, ask you, whether or not you've ever been in a situation where you've been pressured to change your behavior in some way, to conform with other individuals, maybe to do things that you ordinarily wouldn't do, and maybe you complied with those individuals that were requesting you to do that, even though it ran against your ethics, maybe even against your morals. I mean, you wanted to do it maybe so that you wouldn't appear different, from other people. I think that this happens all the time, and I think that this dynamic of conformity, which is a topic that we're going to be taking a look at, is something that is pervasive in our culture, certainly in other cultures where individuals are being pressured. And I think to understand it, because it's played some very important roles in human history, in world history, to understand it, I think is important. So again, we're going to take a look at some classic experiments in this area. But first, some key concepts. First of all, a lot of these experiments involve deception, meaning that what we're going to do is we're going to trick the subjects. We're going to withhold certain information from them, or we're going to give them false information about something. So because we're interested in how they're going to react to particular situations. Um, there's a long history of this in psychology, in social psychology. We're constantly looking at risk versus reward. Are we going to be compromising the subjects in some important way by not revealing to them the true intent of the experiment? A lot of times we simply can't do these experiments unless we withhold information or we deceive the subjects in terms of the intent. So again, these are things that sometimes are difficult to reconcile. And it's always this risk versus reward. There's some wonderful experiments that have been done in psychology, in social psychology, that quite frankly could not be conducted in this day and age. But yet they are some of the most important experiments that have ever been done. But again, it's this whole risk versus reward balance that we constantly have to strike. Um, Another important concept here is the use of what we call confederates or stooges. Now, here's what we mean by this. What we mean is that there are experiments in social psychology in which we solicit the help of individuals that really are not the subjects in the experiment at all, but we ask them to behave in a particular way. And oftentimes we ask them to give answers, for example, that will lead the true subjects in the experiment maybe in a little bit different way in terms of how they go about constructing their answers. Again, these confederates or stooges, they're part of the research team. They're asked to behave in a particular way. And again, it is oftentimes to mislead the true subjects of the experiment. So this is a word we'll be using frequently: confederates or stooges. So it's these three things that I want you to consider in these important experiments that have been done in social psychology. The evolution of this field of social psychology and the study of conformity and obedience really came at a very interesting time. It really came shortly after World War II and the Holocaust and the rise and then the fall of the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler. And indeed, the experiments were experiments that really emerged from that whole social, political era of time. And again, one of the key questions was, about the German people. There were thoughts, certainly in that post-World War II era, in which once people found out about the Holocaust and the German concentration camps, some people started concluding, well, the German people must be sadistic as a race. They were responsible for this. Normal people don't do these kinds of things. Good people don't do these kinds of things. But maybe instead, some people thought, well, maybe all people are capable of doing these unspeakable kinds of things. Maybe the situation that they're in sometimes is so powerful, so overwhelming, that they can in fact be coerced into performing these horrific kinds of acts. So again, this is the atmosphere in which these experiments in social psychology really emerged. One figure, I think more than anyone, who was considered to be the father of social psychology, he was pivotal, Kurt Lewin. 1939, he was a survivor of Nazi Germany. He came here to the United States. And his research comes at this time, this inflection point, in terms of the political structure of Nazi Germany. And that political structure was one that was just perfect for Adolf Hitler to take over and to become the dominant figure in Europe and to engage in this blitz of the rest of Europe to take over Europe and to really promote the whole idea of white supremacy and indeed the destruction, the genocide of various races. So this is, Kurt Lewin, I think, a unique perspective. His family, most of his family was killed in concentration camps. Again, he escapes, he comes to the United States, and he becomes very interested in this whole topic. So he does a fascinating experiment on leadership styles. What he does is he takes these school children that are, middle school age children, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and he puts them into 3 different groups. And each one of those groups has a different leader. One of the groups has a leader that's very authoritarian, very autocratic. Another one has an individual who's very democratic as a leader, and the other one, the other group, has a leader that's hands-off, kind of do anything that you want. And what he does is, what these leaders do is they lead the group of young kids in arts and crafts projects. And the behavior of these kids was studied in those different leadership styles. So again, we have autocratic, essentially meaning you must do what I tell you to do X. Laissez-faire means do really anything that you want. Do X or Y, anything that you see fit. And the other leadership style, the democratic style, says, hey, let's decide what's best and let's do it as a group. So again, let's take a look at the impact of this upon the behavior of these kids in terms of the projects that they do and just overall their behavior in those group situations where they're being led by either an authoritarian leader, a democratic leader, or a leader that's laissez-faire. So the democratic leadership style. The leaders encouraged and assisted the group in terms of making this overall decision, a group decision. And that style of leadership produced really high levels of motivation and really high levels of originality in the work that the kids were doing. So that's what the democratic leadership style resulted in. There was also this autocratic, authoritarian leadership style. Again, the leaders are making all of the decisions. The boys worked hard, but really only when the leader was watching. Okay, when the leader was not watching, they really didn't work so hard. And the boys in this group were very aggressive, very hostile. They were extremely submissive to the leader. So that again, their work in terms of the originality of it wasn't anywhere near as good as that seen in the democratic leadership style. The kids would work hard, but again, only when the leader was watching and directing them. And lastly, the laissez-faire leadership style, again, complete freedom, no guidance whatsoever in terms of what to do. This really resulted in total chaos among the boys and very poor quality of their work that they did on these arts and crafts projects. So this is coming at a time then when, post-World War II, and we're reflecting upon these different styles of government. And the finding by Lewin was one that was really hailed by the American government, that these democratic leadership styles were the best, and the poorest ones were certainly the authoritarian style. So again, this really is the beginning of the examination of a lot of these issues that have to do with conformity, and it's his work, Kurt Lewin's work, that really spawns this whole field, the subdiscipline of psychology that we call social psychology. So another individual who comes along whose work is equally important is that of Solomon Asch and the phenomena of what we call conformity. What does conformity mean? What it means is, altering your behavior to match the behavior of other individuals and to match their expectations. And again, I think that there's so many different cases of this in our everyday life, and the pressure to conform absolutely can be overwhelming. It can be an incredibly coercive experience for a lot of people. So Solomon Asch conducts, again, another one of these incredibly famous experiments in the history of psychology. And what he does is he has subjects look at these lines, okay? Take a look at this line that you see here, and then these other three lines. And clearly this line that you see here is shorter than this line. This line here looks as though it's the same as this one, and in fact it is. And then this line that you see here, that is shorter than this line, but taller than line 1. So what goes on in this experiment is indeed very interesting. There'll be a group of individuals there, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 individuals sitting around a table. And all but one of them is a confederate, okay, of a stooge, okay, that's been coached by Solomon Asch to give an incorrect answer. And they are told, look, when you're asked which of these 3 lines is identical to this line here, always say that it's line 1, which clearly is shorter. But then when we get to the true subject in the experiment, and again, that true subject now has heard these other individuals give incorrect answer. And again, there's deception going on here, and this one true subject doesn't know that these other subjects are stooges, they're confederates. Their help has been solicited by that of Solomon Asch. What about that true subject? Does that true subject give the correct answer, which is this one? this line that we see right here, or does that true subject give the incorrect answer? So again, before answering that one subject and the true subject in the experiment, here's other people giving the incorrect answer. And the question becomes, will that individual conform and also give the incorrect answer? It's a fascinating experiment. And indeed, here's an actual picture that came from that experiment. This individual right here is the true subject in the experiment. They're looking at those lines that I just showed you. This individual is a Confederate, a stooge. This individual is also a Confederate. They are giving incorrect answers, okay? So again, this person in the middle really looks kind of uncomfortable. I mean, he's the real subject. And again, the other participants are Confederates. They're stooges. Their help has been solicited by that of the experimenter. So if we take a look at the impact then of these incorrect answers that are being given and the size of the incorrect majority, and again, we have just one true subject in this experiment. Asch finds that conformity becomes much more frequent as group size increases. Here's group size that we see here. And again, you know, when you have 3 individuals that are giving the incorrect answer, what happens in terms of conformity? Conformity goes way up to roughly about 1/3 of the time. They're also giving the incorrect answer. That is the one person who's the true subject. Once you get up to 3, 4, 5, it kind of stabilizes, okay? And apparently adding more individuals, more Confederates, hence more pressure to conform, that doesn't really seem to change the percentage of individuals, the true subjects that give the incorrect answer. Now, when we also take a look at what we call the impact of unanimity, in other words, what happens if you have just one person who also gives the correct answer, right? So in other words, now you've got 2 individuals, right, instead of just one. And what happens in the face of that with a unanimous incorrect majority? Again, conform about 32% of the trials, but if you have just one person who's an ally giving the correct answer, you're much less likely to conform. See, take a look at this. This is where we just have the one subject, right? And again, these 8 other individuals giving the incorrect answer. Here we have 7 individuals giving the incorrect answer, right? And 2 individuals who are giving the correct answer. So again, the degree of unanimity goes down strikingly in this particular situation. So just having one person who agrees in terms of the correct answer, that's enough to kind of tip everything to a point where you have fewer individuals, you know, the true subjects that are conforming. Fascinating experiment. We now move on to the wonderful experiment that was conducted by Stanley Milgram at Yale University. Again, world-renowned experiment that he conducted. And again, he asks a very important question. You know, again, this is in the post-World War II era. And he asks, you know, what are the factors that contribute to blind compliance that people show when they are in a situation where there's an authority figure there that's demanding that they do certain things that may be against their ethics, things that may be against their sense of right and wrong. And indeed, we call this, you know, obedience. And again, how is it defined? Well, it's compliance. Compliance to the commands of an authority figure. And again, this experiment becomes world-renowned in terms of its impact and importance. So when we take a look at the foundation of this study, we go back to this, this wonderful British historian C.P. Snow, who says, you know, when you think of the long and gloomy history of man, you will find more hideous crimes committed in the name of obedience than have been committed in the name of rebellion. And essentially what this means, of course, is that, you know, it's this compliance to commands of authority figures that's the most important factor. It's not this, you know, high, lofty idea about, you know, the rebellion is, it's about freedom, and, you know, this is why we're engaging in these, you know, hideous kinds of behavior. No, it's obedience, okay? It's obedience to the commands of an authority figure. And when you think of the atrocities in world history, think of the massacres at My Lai. Again, this picture that you see here of these innocent villagers that were slaughtered by American servicemen during the Vietnam War. You think of the Holocaust, where thousands of individuals, thousands of Jews and people also from other races were slaughtered during the Holocaust in these concentration camps. More recently, the genocide in Darfur, where thousands of individuals have been killed. These are, you know, these experiments, these Milgram experiments, are incredibly important for understanding what has happened in those horrific atrocities, both in our past as well as, you know, what is going on, you know, today. So indeed, we need to take a look at these experiments. And Milgram's experiment very much involved deception. The true subjects in the experiment are being told that this is a study that is designed to take a look at the effects of punishment on learning. We want to know what happens when a person who gives the wrong answer in a very simple test of memory, when they give the wrong answer and they're punished, and we're going to punish them by administering electric shock. You know, what happens in that situation in terms of this teacher now that's inflicting punishment upon another individual? Does this teacher, we call this person the teacher, the true subject in this experiment, what happens to their behavior? Do they continue on in this experiment, or do they say, hey, look, you know, I'm not going to hurt this person in this adjacent room. I'm going to leave this experiment because I don't think that this is right. So again, the teacher, the true subject in the experiment, he's punishing by way of electric shocks this person that we classify as a learner who's in an adjacent room. And again, he's a confederate of the experimenter. And it involves the learner in terms of his recall of these very simple word pairs, which I'll show you in just a moment. So again, if we take a look at the basic setup of the experiment, here's our subject, our true subject in the experiment. This is the person we are interested in terms of their behavior. This person is going to be administering shock to this person, another person who we call the learner. He's a fake test subject. He's a confederate. He's a stooge. Again, there's a wall here, so the subject cannot see the learner in the adjacent room. And we have these shock electrodes that are attached to the person's wrists that you see here. And again, every time the learner gives an incorrect answer to a question that's posed by the teacher pulls a lever down on this shock generator panel and shocks the person in the adjacent room. Now, the deception here is this: no shocks are being administered at all. Okay, the shock generator panel essentially has been disconnected. So the teacher thinks that he's administering shocks to the learner in the adjacent room, but once again, no shocks of any kind are being administered. So again, that's a very, very important element, this deception in this experiment. So here's some of these word pairs. Again, prior to the start of the experiment, the learner, again, who's a Confederate, who's a stooge, is being given these word pairs, one of which is tree, limb. So the teacher reads this tree, and then he gives potential answers to the learner. Limb, rock, house, car, and indeed the correct answer is limb. But this individual, this learner who's in the adjacent room, is told, look, I always give the incorrect answer. So for example, if the learner in the adjacent room is given this word tree and is asked to respond to what the correct association is, the learner will say that it's rock, or that it's house, or that it's car, and won't say limb, which is the correct answer, which then means that the teacher now administers shock, okay, by pressing down on that little button on the shock generator panel. And again, here in the adjacent room is the learner, again being hooked up. Again, this is all fake. These electrodes that are being placed on here are actually been disconnected, but the teacher watches this before he goes back into the other room. The teacher watches and in some cases assists putting on these electrodes on the individual's wrist. Again, this is the learner, here is the teacher, and here is the experimenter. So again, this becomes a very interesting experiment. And again, just to take a look at the basics of the study. Here's the teacher, again, in this room, room A. Stanley Milgram is sitting right next to the teacher, and he's telling the teacher, you must complete this experiment. You must go on in this experiment. You may be causing pain to the person in the adjacent room, but you must continue on in the experiment. The learner, again, in the adjacent room, he's our Confederate, he's our stooge, he's doing a good acting job, and again, he's giving these incorrect answers, and then the teacher, thinks he's administering shock when he presses down on that button, but in fact, no shock is being delivered, and the learner would yell and scream when he saw a little light that came on when he gave this incorrect answer. When the teacher is thinking that he's administering shock, no shock is being given, and the learner is yelling and screaming and pounding on the wall. So again, what happens in terms of the teacher's behavior? Do they continue on in the experiment, or do they shut down and leave the experiment? Fascinating question. If you take a look at it, again, the shock voltage that the teacher administers increases with each incorrect answer, so it's becoming more painful all the time. Again, in reality, no shocks are being given at all to the learner, but again, the teacher thinks that he's administering shocks. And again, the learner is acting like they're in pain. They're yelling and they're screaming. And again, this person is the Confederate or the stooge in this situation. So the experimenter, Stanley Milgram, is very sternly telling the teachers, to go on. You must complete the experiment. The learner in that adjacent room now is pounding on the wall and again faking that they're in great pain. So this is an interesting, very interesting test in terms of trying to uncover the dynamics of obedience. So the results of the study, absolutely fascinating. 26 of the 40 teachers in the experiment go all the way to the end of the experiment and administer the most intense shocks. At least they think that they are. Okay, 26 of 40. And when Milgram takes a look at the characteristics of the teachers, he finds out that they're not sadists. They show extreme tension. They show extreme anxiety. And frequently they say that they want to stop. And indeed, some individuals, in fact, would not continue on. So again, it's not as if these individuals are unusual in any way. Again, extensive personality examinations of these individuals revealed that they were really no different from anybody else. That they were not sadists, that they did not like to inflict punishment upon other individuals. So that finding then becomes incredibly important. Now, Milgram studies, we ask the question, what accounts for that obedience? And again, everyone in life is confronted with situations in which they really have to do as they're told. For example, if you're in your car and you're driving too fast and all of a sudden you're stopped by a state policeman, you see that red light going on and the siren. If you don't stop, you're in big trouble. Okay, so indeed you comply and you stop your car and you listen to what that policeman has to say. Hopefully you don't get a ticket, but perhaps you may get a ticket for speeding. But again, this is a situation where you know that you really have to do what that policeman wants you to do, and that's to pull off to the side of the road and listen to what the policeman has to say. For a physical examination that you have from a doctor, you go in, they tell you to undress, and they do an examination. Clearly that's something that you're complying to the commands of that person who's perceived as a legitimate authority figure. But what about a situation where, all of a sudden someone came up to you out of the clear blue and said, well, take all your clothes off? Well, you wouldn't do it. At least I would hope that you would not do it, because you would not perceive that person as being a legitimate authority figure. So we assume that an authority figure knows what they're doing. And again, they may be requesting something of us that runs counter to our morals and ethics. But because they are an authority figure, then you pretty much do what is asked of you. So again, these experiments are very interesting. And if we take a look at some modifications of them, for example, in one modification, Stanley Milgram, instead of being right next to the teacher here in room A, secluded himself in a room where the teacher could not see him. They could communicate by way of an intercom system, but the teacher could not see him. And so the experimenter now is giving these voice commands, and what happens is the degree of obedience drops, where the teacher here is much less likely to go to the end of the shock generator panel and administer the most intense shocks to the learner in the adjacent room. How about when the learner, if we move the learner from this room B, instead we put the learner right in view of the teacher by moving them into room A. So now the teacher actually has to look at them. What happens with this kind of feedback? Not only does he hear the person writhing in pain, but the teacher sees the person responding in a way indicating that it's very painful. What happens in this case is that the degree of obedience drops in the teacher. Again, they're much less likely to shock that person if they can actually see them. Again, hearing them is one thing when the learner is in this room, but when the learner is moved into this room, room A, where the teacher can actually see him, the degree of obedience goes down. Likewise, in a physical proximity, what if you actually had the teacher, who is this individual here, and the learner here, who is sitting right next to the teacher? What if you actually had the teacher forcing his hand down on the electrodes so that the learner could not move at all? So again, now we've got even more feedback in this situation, tactile feedback, and what happens is the teacher in this situation is even less likely to administer the most intense shocks and more likely to leave the experiment. Again, here's another fascinating variation of this. What if we had Confederates, stooges, 4 of them, sitting near the teacher and giving social support for disobedience? In other words, they're saying, don't go on in the experiment. You're really causing great harm to this person in the adjacent room. You really need to leave this experiment. What if you have individuals then that are encouraging the teacher not to comply to the commands of the authority figure, Stanley Milgram? What happens is the degree of obedience goes down even further, and the teacher in this situation is even more likely to leave the experiment. The take-home message in this fascinating series of experiments on obedience, I think, is pretty straightforward. There's always been this feeling that if a person is evil, they're likely to do evil things, and that most of us are good, so we're not likely to do these evil things. But what Milgram studies say is that normal, well-intentioned, well-meaning individuals can be frail. And in the face of, powerful situations, strong situations, and social forces, they also are capable of doing evil. So indeed, these are fascinating experiments that help us to understand this. Milgram writes a book, it's called Obedience to Authority, which became a bestseller here in the United States. Again, these are experiments that were done back in the 1960s. And again, they're probably the most controversial studies that were ever conducted in psychology. And there are so many different disciplines that were interested in them. Political scientists, historians, philosophers, sociologists. But the major interest really is that of how roughly 2/3 of the teachers would go to the end of the shock generator panel and administer the most intense shocks. That's what the true interest was in these experiments. And again, the interest was worldwide. So prior to these studies of Milgram, there were other experiments that utilized shock and deception. And very few people complained about those experiments. Milgram's research, though, really touched a nerve. And it was principally because people would ask of themselves, what would I have done in that situation? Would I have done the same thing? How would I have responded in that situation? So again, this receives worldwide attention, and again, a lot of criticism on the part of both psychologists as well as average lay people after reading about these experiments, believing that, for example, that they were unethical. One person in particular is this woman that you see here, the psychologist. Her name was Diana Baumrind. And she really attacked Stanley Milgram because she thought that in those studies they were really inflicting a lot of stress and tension, loss of dignity on the teachers, the true subjects in the experiment. Milgram, however, says that he didn't really set out to create stress in the subjects, and he said, I believe that people are most disturbed by the results, not so much the methods. So again, they have a debate that goes back and forth, and it's one that really touched off a lot of controversy in terms of the appropriateness of these experiments that involve this really important element of deception. So some other features of Milgram's experiments, one thing that Milgram did was always to arrange for what he called a friendly reconciliation. Here, what we have is the experimenter bringing these two individuals together. This is the teacher right here, and this is the learner. And he's telling the teacher that, no shocks were administered at all. That he in fact was deceiving this individual, so he didn't have to worry about the learner leaving the experiment thinking that it caused irreparable harm to the learner. What we also know is that when Stanley Milgram went about assessing the participants, the teachers in the experiment, the subjects that were classified as teachers, 84% of them said that they were glad that they participated. Only 1.3% stated that they were sorry that they participated. So it's not as if there's some kind of irreparable harm that is being done to those individuals, the participants that were the teachers. Indeed, he does follow-ups later on with a psychiatrist, again a year later, and he shows no negative signs of trauma at all in those teachers that were the true subjects of the experiment. So Milgram studies, they really increase our sensitivity to ethical issues and research. Certainly the guidelines now by the American Psychological Association, as well as other professional organizations and our federal government concerning how subjects should actually be treated. And again, make sure that there are safeguards there. And a lot of this happens in these institutional review boards, IRBs, that are at every institution that consists of both scientists and non-scientists, as well as lay people from the community, from the public, who make decisions about whether or not experiments, individual experiments and experimental proposals that work with, that have to utilize subjects, whether or not those experiments indeed are ones that are ethical, and whether or not they are ones that are going to cause only limited amounts of discomfort to the participants. So there's a lot of questions still in this area. Certainly, was the extreme deception unethical? Did the dramatic results really justify the emotional stress? Could less deceptive methods be used and maybe still get the same results? In other words, could you reinvent these experiments in some way in order to get around some of those ethical kinds of dilemmas? And lastly, under what conditions are deceptive practices justified? So again, this is very important work done by Stanley Milgram. That's really helped us to explain a lot about obedience. It's helped us to explain a lot about certain historical events and why those events occurred. So the contributions that have been made by social psychology have been enormous. And this is just, a brief exploration of this in terms of some of the most famous experiments in the field of social psychology. So that really ends our course in terms of these lectures. I've certainly enjoyed doing it. I hope that you have enjoyed listening to these lectures. And I do hope that many of you will continue on in the field of psychology and take more advanced courses. And maybe even someday think about going to graduate school to get a master's degree or a doctoral degree in psychology. So that wraps it up. And again, I hope in the future that I'll see some of you in some other courses that I teach.